Just before the Titanic sank to the bottom of the ocean, the ship sent out a distress signal containing its exact location. The coordinates sent out by the Titanic were extremely useful. The nearby ship arms Carpathia quickly headed towards them. And in fact, all survivors of the Titanic were rescued by THS ship, and if it was easy to find the lifeboats, it seems like it would be easy to find the wreck. But this turned out to be wrong, and locating the ship became a puzzle that would take decades of technological advancements to solve and spurred a race between several explorers, all competing to be the first. This is how the Titanic was found, with the last known location of the Titanic already recorded. The most immediate question after it sank wasn't focused on finding the wreckage, but rather how to raise it from the ocean floor nearly 2 miles below to surface. Technology just wasn't there in 1912 for divers to reach even a fraction of such depths, and absurd ideas, such as using dynamite to dislodge the bodies from the wreck, were quickly scrapped. It would take more than 40 years in 2 world wars that brought with them technological advancements, such as submarines and sonar, for the first serious expedition. To head back out to the Titanic's last known location in 1953, Risson Beasley, the founder of a salvage company from England, decided to try his hand at finding the impossible visible. Here are the coordinates from the distress call the Titanic made before it sank, sent out at 10:35 p.m. Your New York time? But even with the coordinates in hand, the search radius has to be quite a bit larger. The distress call was made 2 hours before the entire ship slipped beneath the water time in which the Titanic could have drifted, and the currents could have pushed the ship even further while it was sinking. The ocean is vast, and trying to find one single point on the ocean floor in complete darkness is nearly impossible. Wisden Beasley began by dropping dynamite over the reported location of the Titanic wreckage. These explosives would create an echo that, using sonar, could be plotted to create a bottom profile, which Beasley hoped would reveal the ship, basically a very imprecise early version of sonar mapping, in fact, too imprecise to yield any results, as Beasley found no luck. 20 more years would pass after his attempt, when Robert Ballard, a marine geologist, wanted to make history in 1977. The Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution had developed new survey equipment for mapping out the ocean floor. Ballard was tasked with testing this new state-of-the-art tech, but personally his motivation lied with using this equipment for finding the Titanic. In the middle of the ship was a hole that would allow a long pipe to be extended into the water. Just above the ocean floor, attached to the end of this pipe, Ballard rigged a pot that contains sonar and cameras, with the hope that it would be able to detect the Titanic's wreckage once the ship passed above it. The expedition began with some early tests when suddenly disaster struck. The drill pipe broke, sending thousands of feet of pipe and the pot containing the expensive equipment crashing to the ocean floor, ending the search before it could even begin. Heartbroken and embarrassed, Ballard had to return to the institution without the expensive equipment he was set out to test, and without any hint on the Titanic. More years would pass, and even during an age where the technology had finally advanced enough, it should theoretically be possible to find the Titanic. Having the resources to undertake such an expedition was another matter entirely. Every trip had the potential to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and not many were willing to part with so much money for what could be a fruitless search, that is, until Jack Grimm entered the scene. Grimm was an eccentric oil tycoon based out of Texas, and he was no stranger to trying to find the impossible. He had previously tried to find Noah's Ark, and he had also financed expeditions to find the Loch Ness Monster Bigfoot, and even an attempt to prove the hollow earth theory by trying to find a large hole in the North Pole. Now Grimm was determined to solve the mystery of the Titanic, even though Grimm had the money. He lacked the other piece of the puzzle, the technology and knowledge. He knew he would need a capable team with the expertise to work the equipment that would be required to accomplish this. He donated $300,000 to the Geological Observatory of the Columbia University in New York in exchange for the equipment and crew he needed for the search. He would be joined by renowned scientist Dr. William Ryan and Dr. Fred S.P., an unlikely alliance between two renowned scientists and A conspiracy theory-driven oil tycoon, perhaps exactly what's needed to find the ship. It seemed everything was lined up for this expedition to be a success. But Grimm believed one thing. Located Dr. Ryan and Dr. Spee were shocked, not used to scientific pursuits being joined with what they considered a performance act. The scientists threatened to leave the expedition and told Grimm directly that it is either them or the monkey, and, to their surprise, Jack Grimm actually chose the monkey. In the end, cooler heads prevailed, and Grimm was finally persuaded to leave Titan behind, and the expedition could finally begin. The crew headed to the coordinates from the Titanic's distress. Call, and they would lower a side-looking sonar attached to a cable into the ocean, which would be towed along the ocean floor. This type of sonar sends out acoustic pinks to each side. This way, there is a small area beneath the probe without any data. But on the sides, large areas of the ocean floor can quickly be mapped, and unusual shapes and bumps are spotted once such a shape has been found. An onboard magnetometer would be used to detect if that shape is metal, essentially, if it is man-made, or just a natural feature of the seabed. Finally, transponders were dropped in the ocean that would keep track of the sonar itself, so any areas of interest could be precisely marked with coordinates. But even after searching the entire area around the ship's coordinates, the crew found nothing, and increasingly the scientists started to doubt the accuracy of the initial coordinates. Even though the Titanic gave its last known location here, the survivors that escaped in lifeboats were actually picked up around here much farther east than they should have been, even accounting for ocean drift. Knowing this, the scientists theorized that the coordinates the Titanic gave were actually wrong, as the first officer did not account for a time change as they were traveling, and the only reason the Carpathia was still able to rescue people was because the actual recite was somewhere within the path towards the false coordinates. This opens the search area quite significantly, and they now believe the Titanic had a high probability of being somewhere in this 500 m rectangle with the old coordinates ruled out. It was time to, once again, begin searching. The crew used a process commonly referred to as mowing the lawn, towing the sonar in overlapping lines. Each pass they would mark anything that stood out from the sonar's readings, but there was an issue. The magnetometer, which was supposed to let them know if any of these abnormal shapes were metal, was broken. And to make matters worse, bad weather rolled in, threatening the entire expedition. Itself determined to carry out the mission, they still carried on and continued marking every abnormal area of interest they came across. And each time they found a new one, Grimm's excitement grew, continuing until the last area was marked, making 14 in total. Grimm was convinced that one of these areas had to be the Titanic, but he wouldn't get the chance to prove it. Time had run out. The charter for the equipment in the ship they were using was about to expire, and they needed to head home. Not ready to give up over the course of the next year, the scientists and Grimm prepared to set back out once again, this time using a more advanced sonar than the one they had used previously. One by one, each area was looked at in more detail, and one by one they were ruled out as natural features. On the very final day, ready to give up, they decided, as a last-ditch effort to try to use digital film, the camera would be fixed on a sled and dragged above the ocean floor after passing the route. The camera was brought up to review the footage, and while watching, a new, strange shape began to appear. Looking closer, it started to look more and more like a propeller. Grimm was immediately convinced that they had done it. They had found a piece of the Titanic. Unfortunately, though, the time had run out, and before they could investigate further, they were once again forced to head home. Feeling that victory was just within reach, Grimm was ready to hat back out a third time in 1983 to investigate. This propeller shape, he searched and searched, but found nothing. There has since been much debate over what Grimm found, whether the shape was in fact a propeller, or rather just a rock, with even his own scientists disputing Grimm over what the shape. Could be either way. It would never be located again, while Jack Grimm was busy with his expeditions. Robert Ballard had watched from the sidelines, disheartened by his own failed attempt earlier, but not ready to fully give up on like Grim Ballard. Did not have immense wealth at his disposal, but what he had was his own unique advantage ties with the U.S. Navy. Ballard had approached the U.S. Navy with a proposal to design a new submersible that could be used to locate the Titanic. The Navy, however, wasn't so interested in the Titanic, but they were interested in the submersible. The U.S. Navy made Ballard a deal. They would fund his project, but he would need to use the equipment to help them first on a completely different mission. Ballard agreed and began to develop this new tool for deep-sea exploration. Argo is a deep-towed sled that is remotely navigated above the ocean floor, attached to a research vessel by a long cable and piloted by a team on board. The sled is outfitted with SID scanning sonar as well as cameras that provide real-time imaging of the ocean floor. Still in the late stages of the Cold War, the U.S. Navy wanted to investigate two nuclear submarines that had been lost, the USS Fresher and the USS Scorpion. However, they didn't want the Russians to know about this, and so Ballard was deployed in 1984 under the guise of testing Argo in order to find the Titanic. In reality, he was to map out the wreckage side of both submarines in order to assess any radioactive threats. Using Argo, Ballard studied the wreck sites of the submarines, and he began to pick up on something peculiar about both of them. Ballard noticed that as the warships sank to increasing depths, their wreckages imploded, creating a debris field around them. The heavier pieces sank closer to the wreckage itself, but the lighter pieces were carried away from the wreckage, leaving a sort of comet trail around it. An idea began to form in Ballard's mind while searching for the Titanic. Everyone had attempted to find the ship itself, a needle in a haystack. But what if instead of trying to find the ship, he would look for the debris field that was likely around the wreckage? If he could find any parts of the debris, he could follow the comet trail back to the ship. A revelation that would change everything, but before searching for the Titanic, Ballard would still need to bide his time and continue his mission for the U.S. Navy. He finally caught a lucky break in 1985 when he was sent out once again to map out the USS Scorpion this time. However, he would be allowed to use any remaining time. He had to take Argo on a search for the Titanic, knowing the deadline would be tied. Ballard reached out to the French oceanographic institution IFR, and they devised a two-phase strategy. The first part of the search would be led by Jean-Louis Michel of IFR, and the second part would be done by Robert Ballard. The idea was simple. Michel would first scout the entire search area using sonar mapping, just so that in the second step, Ballard could focus his limited time to search only the most interesting spots they came up with. These two search areas, and while Robert Ballard was still carrying out his mission for the Navy, Michel would begin by using the same mowing the lawn technique that Jack Grimm had used, scanning the ocean floor using a more advanced sonar. These search lines were not always exactly straight. Ocean currents would often drift the boat away, adding yet another challenge when it was time for Ballard to join and take over the search. Michel had not found anything, and to add even more pressure to the growing sense of another potential failed expedition, only 12 days remained before Ballard would need to return, whether he found anything or not, in order to use his limited time as effective as possible. Robert Ballard came up with a plan. Informed by what he has learned about the debris fields, he would not look for the ship itself, but rather for its debris field. He also knew that on the night the Titanic sank, there was an ocean current going south. Therefore, lighter pieces in the debris field should have drifted towards the south. He came up with an estimate of how big the debris field should be. Now he started searching, but instead of carefully doing lines over the entire search area, he would space out his lines just far enough apart that he should theoretically run into this debris field. Spacing these lines out allows him to cover a much larger area in a small amount of time. He also decided to rely much more on the camera feedback rather than on the sonar. Data cameras had been used in past expeditions, such as when Jack Grimm believed he found a propeller from the Titanic, but his camera was not capable of providing live video feed. Argo instead could, and Ballard would be almost exclusively relying on the video rather than sonar. His team would take turns piloting Argo and watching the video feed. Around-the-clock days rolled by with nothing but the landscapes of the ocean floor passing through the video feed, and the crew was beginning to feel the mounting pressure of the approaching deadline. The night watch was especially difficult, with the crew making sure to keep themselves awake, as it felt like they watched the same natural features. Roll by minute for minute, but then suddenly, the rocks they were watching started to look less like rocks and more like man-made debris. Now they were glued to the screens, the blurry images coming more into focus. Definitely not rods, not daring to look away for. Even a crew member quickly flashed-packed down the ship's cook so that he could grab Ballard from his room. Within seconds, Ballard joined the crew on their monitors, and after a few more tense moments, an even larger shape began to fill the screen. There was no mistaking, as they'd studied photos of the Titanic until they knew every detail by heart. Argo had just passed over the Titanic spoiler. After 73 years of searching, they had finally found the Titanic. Its location was a mere 300 hours eft away from where Michelle had searched. Previously, the ocean currents drifting him away from the wreck. Immediate celebrations kicked off, disbelief and excitement making its way through everyone on board. But it was not for long until the reality of what they'd found sank in, and the celebration was replaced with a moment of silence, with the crew